Chapter 6. Roland got out of the back of the cart and watched the god and goddess relax as the dark one flew off, Lyra in his arms. His mind was reeling with everything he had seen, and as the full impact of the events hit him, he felt sick. We should follow him. This isn't at full strength. We can reseal him now, Felvar said, anger still laced into his voice. We should follow him, Gaia mocked. And how do you propose we reseal him? Even weakened, he was able to fight us off. You saw what happened when my roots touched him. He simply swiped them away. She walked towards Felvar, shaking her head. No, whatever has happened, we won't be able to do the seal again. Felvar grunted. Then what do you propose we do? Call a council. See if we can recruit the others to our cause, Gaia responded. Ha! They're all lazy. Felvar turned towards Gaia as he spoke. Besides, they wouldn't help us last time. They know Dis's hatred is focused primarily on us. They'll leave us to face him alone while they come up with their own plans to deal with him. Still, we must try, Gaia countered, authority filling her voice. But just because we call a council doesn't mean we have to rely solely on the others' help. She looked slowly at Roland, Cyrus, and Sarah, then turned to look at Severin. I see 4 humans already willing to fight him. Their village was the one that was supposed to protect his seal, so in a way, he is their responsibility as well. Felvar stepped close. His voice was barely audible to even Gaia's ears. Be careful what you suggest. I don't want to do that again. I'm not suggesting anything. This time it was Gaia's turn to be angry. There won't be a fall this time, because this time we will do what we should have done the first time. When she finished, she walked towards Severin and waved at the children to come over as well. You have all shown great strength today, facing down the Dark One, the god of death, Dis. But it was up to your village to keep him sealed to begin with. She paused and looked at each member of the quartet, her eyes stern like a mother scolding her children. The only way the seal could have failed is if a member of your village failed and broke part of the seal. The 4 of you have already proven your worth, but I'm hoping you will continue to prove your worth. We need you to help us fight. Her voice held resolve. She locked eyes with each of the youths, one at a time, finishing with Severin. My respects, but these 3 are children, Severin said meekly. I will gladly go to do your bidding, but please leave them out of it. Felvar stepped forward, placing a hand on Severin's shoulder. The battle prowess of a Time Warden is formidable, you more so than many others of your kind, but you cannot fight him alone. Felvar looked from Roland to Cyrus, then faced Roland. Son, are you willing to fight for the sake of the world against the embodiment of darkness itself? Roland felt his heart freeze. Felvar, a god, was standing there, addressing him with a tone of respect. He felt his mouth go dry and his hands start shaking, but somehow managed to force himself to speak. Yes, sir. Then I will give you a gift to help you in this battle. Felvar held up his hand. Bolts of lightning started striking his palm, over and over, blurring Roland's vision. When the lightning stopped and Roland's eyes cleared, he saw that Felvar held a ball of pure white. I bestow upon you the powers of the God of Thunder. I make you one of my wardens. However small, from this day on, you will have a fragment of my power. No! Shouted Severin. He held himself in place, muscles tense. Felvar ignored his outburst. Roland felt his heart beating, so fast he thought it would explode. Felvar lowered his hand, then suddenly flattened it against Roland's chest. Roland let out a cry and started to collapse. Whatever power was flowing into him held him up. A burning sensation pulsed through him, as if fire were pumping through his veins. His muscles tensed and his back arched. He couldn't feel anything but pain and fire coursing through his veins over his body. After what felt like hours, just as his mind felt like it would snap, the pain lifted. Roland collapsed to the ground, heaving deep breaths, the adrenaline still coursing through him, making his thoughts cloudy. As his mind cleared, he felt energized in a way he never had before. He felt as if he had become 1,000 times more in tune with his body. He felt as if he could will each individual hair to move, every muscle to twitch independently, even breathe with each lung individually if he wished. Gaia, standing beside Sarah, spoke up. And I will grant this girl here, who displays such wisdom for one her age, a fragment of my power. Gaia looked over at Sarah. My apologies, but I am not quite as theatrical as Felvar. He is the god of thunder in every way. Then, in a quieter voice still, meant only for Sarah's ears, Gaia said, I'm unsure how you managed to get an arrow into Dis's shoulder, but that would make you worthy even outside of current circumstances. Be proud, You are worthy. Roland looked over towards Sarah, noticing Severin standing near her, panic on his colorless face. Roland felt wonderful, but seeing Severin so out of sorts brought a prickle at the back of his mind. He pushed those sensations aside for the time being, though. Gaia held out her hand, and a soft green light filled it, as if swirling out of the wind itself. She took Sarah's hand and placed it over the ball, then brought it up. As their hands closed on one another, the ball was gently absorbed into Sarah. Sarah took a deep breath, and Roland noticed that instead of seeming to burn in agony like he had, she practically radiated relaxation. Though Sarah's eyes were closed, she felt as if they had truly opened for the first time. She could sense every bit of life around her. She could feel the bugs hiding in the still standing houses, the few domesticated animals still standing in the nearby field, wild rabbits hiding in their burrow out in the woods, and every person still left in or near the town. She felt connected and close to those around her. When she opened her eyes, they fell on Roland, and she could see a soft glow around him. She turned her head and looked towards Gaia. Gaia's light burned like a sun, but one that didn't hurt her eyes to look at. She straightened her back and stood tall, nodding towards her new patron. Gaia noticed Roland's puzzled expression and spoke. Giving one powers of war and violence costs the recipient pain, to make sure they know the price of using their gift. Giving one a gift of life, on the other hand, causes one to experience a great sense of inner peace. Gaia smiled, almost sadly, at Roland. "What have you done?" Severin asked, weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I know of your love for these children, I will ignore your insolence. We have conscripted you all into service." Felvar strode over to Severin, looking him dead in the eye. "You will travel far to the north. You must cross over the dragon's spine, across the bone wastes, all the way to the location of Dis's original home. The home he had before he became a god." Severin looked up, relief seeming to wash over his face. "You mean you aren't sending us to face off against the Dark One directly?" Severin asked, strength slowly returning to his voice. "Of course not," Felvar laughed. "If we wanted you dead, we would simply kill you ourselves." Felvar's face quickly turned serious again. "Don't believe for a second, though, that this is a mission without danger. You're crossing lands guarded by beasts that my kind is placed to protect the trails and cannot easily recall. You will pass through lands whose people are not quite so peaceful as yours, and whose allegiances keep them from obeying me. I will do everything in my power to help you on your journey, but some of the places you will pass through are not of my domain, and as such, I am severely limited in them." Felvar turned and started walking back towards the center of the now cleared town square. "Until you reach the Serpent Spine, we can do little to assist you, but once you reach the mountains, you may stop in my domain. There is a city there, Drakenfell, my home. I will prepare you for what you will face in the wastes once you reach me. You know well enough how to deal with woods, so you should be fine until then. The first leg of your journey should be easy, considered a test of your most basic skills." Felvar suddenly jumped towards the sky. Once he was high up, there was a sudden flash followed by a loud crack, and he was gone. "I would suggest you gather your supplies and leave no later than dawn," Gaia spoke. "We are going to do what we can to try and take care of Dis, but you are key to our backup plan. You must hurry. If we fail, the fate of everything may come down to whether or not your mission has been a success." She turned to leave. Roland jumped forward. "Wait!" he shouted. "What exactly is it we are doing? You've told us where we are going, but not why." Gaia stopped. A look of annoyance crossed her face, but was quickly replaced by a smile. "Don't worry about the details. Just know you are going to help us obtain a powerful weapon we have locked away. You will learn more at Drakenfell." She turned away from Roland, and as she walked, she seemed to sink into the ground, only a trail of flowers left where she had been just moments before. A shadow snaked its way across the remains of the sacred orchard. It darted quickly from tree to tree, as if searching urgently for something. It paused below the bodies of Fallon and Ress, slowly circling the pools of blood, but moved off. Finally, it came across the body of Sean, laying prone on the ground. He had been left for dead, but a small spark of life still beat within him. The shadow slowly expanded, forming a hole in the ground. A misty blue figure, dripping shadows, rose up out of the hole. The figure leaned forward, stretching out a hand toward Sean. Sean's body lifted from the ground and floated over to the figure until the tip of the figure's finger was resting on Sean's chest. Sean's eyes fluttered and slowly opened to slits. A hiss seemed to fill the air, and slowly the sound started to form words. Do you wish to take revenge on the one who did this to you, child? Sean's mouth worked, opening and closing over and over, until finally he was able to breathe out a single yes. Good. I will heal you and give you a few toys to use against your abuser. There's a group preparing to leave Headshelm on a quest from Felvar and Gaia. Your healing will take a little time, but as soon as you can, you must set off after them and find a way to make them accept you into their group. Stay with them, and eventually you will have your chance to kill the girl responsible for this. The figure released Sean, letting him fall roughly to the ground. But be warned, if you fail in your task, or expose what you were given, you will be punished worse than even your twisted imagination can comprehend. Chapter 7. Lyra was both terrified and thrilled as she hurtled through the air in Dis's arms. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined soaring through the air like a bird. Dis leaned a bit, and Lyra could see the trees far, far below. They were moving so fast she barely had time to make out an individual tree before it was lost in the blur of motion. She felt a tugging at her stomach and realized they were starting to slow down. Dis swept them into an opening in the trees and gently touched the ground. As soon as they were down, he placed Lyra on her feet, holding her shoulder long enough for her to regain her balance. He stretched his arms, yawned, and as he did so, his wings simply faded away. From here, we walk, he said, smiling at Lyra. Don't worry, we won't go too far before setting up camp for the rest of the night. I'd just rather not stay exactly where we landed. As he finished, he bowed lightly at Lyra and started to stroll off through the woods. Lyra's head was a jumble. She had so many questions she didn't even know where to begin. How was he free? Why had he saved her? Why had he brought her with him? She took a deep breath and followed him. As Lyra followed him, she was trying to build up her nerves to start talking to Dis, but every time she opened her mouth to speak, she froze. What if he decided he should send her away because she wanted to talk? After 10 minutes of this, she simply gave up and decided to see just what happened. It was another half hour before Dis finally came to a stop at a small clearing. It looked to Lyra like they had come across an incredibly old campground. There was a fire pit that didn't look like it had been used in ages, rocks evenly scattered close to the fire as seats, and the branches of the trees overhead had been carefully woven together to form something like a roof with a hole in the middle for smoke. Leaf litter buried some of the shorter seats, and the fire pit would need to be straightened up, but someone had put enough work in at some point in time that no one needed to come by often for this campsite to keep existing. Wait here for one moment, dear, and I'll get some kindling and something for you to eat, Dis said, with the same warm smile that Lyra was coming to love. He walked off into the darkness. She felt worried watching him leave. Was this just some uncomplicated way for him to leave her behind? Deciding not to worry herself over what she could hardly begin to control, Lyra walked over to one of the stones and sat down. It was cold, but oddly comfortable. It felt as if years of use had worn it into the perfect shape for sitting on. For the first time that night, she noticed the cold. Lyra started to realize she was close to freezing, but the thrill of everything that had happened had driven all thought of anything but the present out of her mind. Given time to just sit and think, she found herself getting worried. Was this kind man, her savior, truly the god of death and darkness? To try and warm up and quiet her mind, she started to straighten out the campsite. Lyra was startled when Dis appeared in front of her, holding a stack of wood big enough to feed a fire for 3 days under his arm, and clutching a dead hare in his other hand. Here we go. I think this should be enough. What do you think? He asked. Lyra simply nodded agreement. He stepped forward and in moments had the wood set up for a campfire. He picked up a rock and, to Lyra's amazement, simply scratched a finger across the top of it, causing sparks to shoot out as if he had taken a knife to the flint. The fire caught and immediately jumped to full force. As Lyra felt the heat radiate off of it, she felt herself start to relax, relishing the feeling as the cold was driven from her limbs. Dis stepped to the side and picked up a stick to roast the hare with. Lyra was wondering how he would dress it. She had seen him use a sword back at Headshelm, but she didn't see it now, nor did she see any kind of knives on his belt. To her surprise, he simply grabbed the hare's head and with one quick motion pulled it off, taking the skin with the head. He spitted the hare and set it to roasting on the fire. While your dinner is cooking, would you like to talk for a bit? Dis asked, a bit of seriousness flowing into his face. I imagine you have at least a few questions you would like to ask. Lyra fiddled with the cloth of her dress, nervousness flooding through her. He was right. She did. But could she really ask? Come on, he prodded gently. It's okay. You can ask whatever you wish. I invited questions, and I'm not going to punish you for taking up my invitation. He reached out and lifted her chin so he could look her in the eyes. After all, why would I bring you with me if I didn't want you here? He smiled softly at her. Lyra took a deep breath and asked the one question that burned the most in her mind. Why did you bring me with you? Why save me? Sadness crept into Dis's eyes. Why wouldn't I want my daughter with me? Lyra immediately felt confused. She wasn't his daughter. She knew who her parents were, even though they had left the village the year she was born. She hadn't known why they had left her in the care of Rickard, but after today she had been able to piece it together. I can't be your daughter, she whispered. Dis sat back. He took a deep breath and began to answer. I know you only found out today you were meant to be sacrificed. Do you know why you were going to be killed? Lyra, choosing her words carefully, answered. To keep you bound to the tree. Well, that is what your people are told, Dis said, speaking matter-of-factly. That is not the whole truth. The act of killing you in and of itself did nothing to bind me. It is true that the blood of an innocent would strengthen the bonds that held me in place, but only marginally. The truth is my prison was fairly well secure. The reason you were going to be sacrificed was because you were the reincarnation of my daughter. How? Lyra asked. The legends say nothing about you having a daughter. They also say I killed my own wife, which isn't true, but that is neither here nor there. When she died, she was pregnant. As part of my punishment, anger started to spread across Dis's face. As part of my punishment, Dis hissed the word. Gaia decided to have my daughter sacrificed over my prison on her 16th birthday, forever. Dis stood and started pacing back and forth. Every time you were born, you looked the same. Always the same. The villagers forced you to tend to my cell so that I could watch you grow. He started running a hand through his hair. Over and over again, I saw you bloom into the woman you are right now. Every time I watched them bleed you dry. He screamed the last sentence. As he finished, he punched a tree that had gotten too close to him, leaving a hole where his fist made contact. But not this time. He turned to Lyra and smiled. Slowly he walked toward her. She could feel her pulse racing. She was becoming a little frightened of him. As he reached out to stroke her cheek, she cringed back. She saw his face fall. Please forgive me. I lost my temper. The small side effect of my powers is that they make your moods a little volatile. He kneeled down in front of her, looking her dead in the eye. For the first time since his release, she saw him looking completely serious. Don't worry around me, though. No matter how far from the edge I fall, I would never hurt you. I've watched you for 2,000 years, wanting to protect you, wanting to get revenge on the coward that punished you because of me. There is nowhere safer you could be than by my side. Lyra felt the truth in what he said, felt a different type of warmth start to spread through her. Gently he pulled her forward into an embrace. She had never felt this safe, this secure, before. It was someone, finally, that simply cared about her. Her father, her true father, was showing her the love she had missed her whole life. She felt him kiss the top of her head, and a tear escaped from the corner of her eye. Dis leaned back, and with a warm smile, wiped the tear from her eye. No need for tears. There would be plenty of time to cry ahead. He turned and suddenly raced to the fire. Ha! We almost let your dinner burn. He pulled the hair from the fire and fixed the stick in the ground near Lyra. Eat. If you're able to stay awake afterwards, we can talk some more. If not, we can talk tomorrow. I guess I should fetch you some water. He turned to go get the water, but Lyra stopped him. Wait, aren't you going to eat with me? She asked. He chuckled. Honey, I haven't had to eat in a long, long time. Don't worry, I'll fetch some water and be back quickly to sit with you while you dine. With that, he turned and walked back into the woods. Once Dis found himself out of earshot of Lyra, he spoke to the shadows, his voice devoid of emotion. So, how long have you been watching? Just since you broke free from the tree, my lord, came a hiss from the darkness. Well, I don't appreciate you eavesdropping, Dis said, his voice flat and commanding. Or at least trying to. Pathos was your name, wasn't it? Yes, my lord, the shadow hissed. You're master of spies. Good. I thought I would have to summon you. Dis finally found the creek he was hunting for. As he knelt down to feel a skin he had fashioned from the hare's hide, using a touch of his power over death to age it into leather, he continued to address Pathos. You know the village I flew from? Yes, my lord. Go back and watch for any groups leaving. Dis paused, thinking. If you see any, let me know who they are. There's a time warden in the village, an older man, obviously an ex-soldier. If he is with them, find out where they are going. The group bearing the very man is being dispatched north, my lord. Pathos responded. Dis stopped, facing the direction he knew Pathos was in. How do you know this already? And speak plainly. Plainly put, I'm not a fool, the shadow hissed, moving closer to Dis. Hanging from a cloak made of pure night were thin, pale arms capped by overly large hands. Faintly, a face could be detected in the darkness. I was already in the neighborhood when you were released. I always come to watch the ritual in case a mistake were made. Dis thought he detected what would pass for a smile across the creature's face. I guess this was the lucky year after all. After everything had finished, I thought it best to linger for a moment after your fight to see if anything interesting could be learned. Dis sneered at the wraith. Anything else you would like to share? Felvar gave the boy that attacked with the sword his gift, and Gaia, the female archer, hers, Pathos hissed. Interesting. Curiosity built in Dis's voice. Go back and follow them. When you can be certain of their destination, let me know. Yes, my lord. Dis rolled his eyes as the wraith wrapped in on itself and faded away. He stood, the water skin filled, and walked back to enjoy the rest of his first evening free in 2,000 years, to enjoy time with his daughter, finally being able to speak back to her. Chapter 8. Severin stood staring at the center of the town square. He was still stunned, lost for words to describe what had just happened. His face was stark white, the blood having yet to return to it. His hands faintly trembled, and he seemed to be quietly muttering to himself. Roland, feeling the euphoric aftershocks of receiving his powers receding, cautiously walked towards Severin. He had never seen Severin like this. Roland felt a need to get Severin back to reality. Severin, are you all right? He asked, placing a hand gently on Severin's shoulder. Severin jumped, his head snapping in Roland's direction. Not at all. None of us are, he replied. Severin took a deep breath, and to Roland's relief, the color started to come back to him. But I guess there's little to be done about that anymore. Severin walked quickly forward, placing a hand on Roland's shoulder, pulling him along. He stopped once he was standing beside Cyrus, with Sarah in front of them. Listen to me carefully. He looked each in the eye, making sure they were paying attention. The tone of his voice was quiet, but severe. We have basically been conscripted. We aren't being sent directly after Dis, but have no doubt, we are still walking into danger. The three of you have never been further than the borderlands, and truth be told, that is not a very long journey. We are preparing to go through lands occupied not just by thieves and brigands, but by creatures you cannot imagine. As a point of fact, I'm not very worried about thieves at all. Roland felt a shiver rush through him and pushed it away as quickly as he could. Despite the confidence he felt from being gifted by the gods, the way Severin spoke had still gotten to him. But Sarah and I have powers now, like yours. What could possibly stand against us? Roland asked. Roland had just enough time to register Severin's appearance flicker before he was sent flying through the air. He felt the breath knocked out of him as he landed hard on his back. Before he could even start to fight for air, he felt a foot being pressed down onto his chest. Yes, we have powers. Yes, you are stronger. But do you know how to use those powers yet? Severin said, his voice unchanged from before. Roland couldn't get the breath to respond, so he simply shook his head. Severin stepped off his chest and helped Roland to his feet. I'm sorry for that, but you must understand. You aren't a threat to anyone. Yet. I'll help the two of you as much as I can, but my powers are as similar to yours as water is to fire. I'll tend to the horses. Sarah, Cyrus, go to your homes and leave notes for your families to find when they return. Pack as many supplies as you can. It'll be at least 2 weeks before we reach Drakenfell. Roland, take one of the horses back to our wagon. Bring back the water and the provisions we had packed there. As Severin finished speaking, he seemed to finally settle back into his old self. You all have 1 hour. As soon as you're all back, we set off. Couldn't we stop to take a bit of a nap before we leave? Cyrus asked, his voice pleading. I've not been gifted like the rest of you. I'm not really certain why I'm coming along, but even more so, I'm tired as hell and want to rest a bit. Severin walked toward Cyrus. a wicked grin spreading across his face. You're right, I'm sorry. He reached out, patting Cyrus on the shoulder. Cyrus smiled, seeming surprised that Severin agreed with him. Make sure to pack some rope, and I'll tie you to the saddle so you can rest a bit. Cyrus's face dropped and his eyes widened. That won't be necessary, sir, Cyrus responded. Severin's smile fell quickly. I'm glad to hear that. I'm not certain why you're supposed to come with us either, but don't worry, before all is said and done, you'll be able to go toe-to-toe with any of us. Severin's smile returned, a bit friendlier this time. That is one type of training I can do all on my own. Once everyone was back together, all their tasks completed, they set out. Roland looked around carefully as they left town. He wanted to remember every detail, and even with the destruction fresh from the fight, he could still see the place he loved peeking from below. Part of him felt this might be the last time he was ever in Headshelm. They rode out of town through the north gate, following the old trail that led towards the sacred grove. Roland kept glancing over his shoulder, seeing the village grow smaller and smaller. Finally, after they passed the grove, now nothing but dead trees, the town vanished altogether. Roland was finally starting to feel real apprehension settle in. He was headed north, a direction he had never planned on traveling in, to a destination he had never even heard of before last night. He felt something different inside of himself, something he was certain his new power was causing. But instead of comforting him, this simply made him more nervous. The group rode on in silence for what felt like hours. Everyone was lost in their own thoughts, all of them starting to feel the pressure of the task they were undertaking. The silence did nothing but reinforce this. The longer they were quiet, the more nervous each of them became. The more nervous they became, the less they wanted to talk. Severin, having some experience in traveling both alone and with an army, decided he should break the silence. Sarah, ride with me for a moment. Sarah looked up quickly, jerked from her thoughts by the sudden noise. She heeled her horse up beside Severin's. Yes, sir. You know I was a soldier, right? He asked, his voice gentle. Yes, Sarah responded, wondering where Severin was going with this. I was selected by Cronus, given powers as a time warden, Severin continued, looking ahead as he talked. Roland and Cyrus perked up, paying attention now. Severin rarely spoke about his past. They weren't about to miss any detail he might provide. As such, I was put into a special unit made of other chosen. Severin sighed, his voice becoming more casual than any of them had ever heard. There were quite a few of us. Apparently there was some minor bet between the gods involving which side would be victorious. As such, they tried to spike the odds in their favor by providing each army with chosen. He glanced back to Roland. I met a few of Felvar's chosen. He and Cronus happened to be on the same side. Roland's mind raced. Severin had known others that had been given the same gift as him. He could feel a bit of the tension that had been building in him ease. He found himself thinking that maybe they weren't heading into this as blindly as he had been thinking. Severin looked at Sarah, locking eyes with her. But no matter which side you were on, you became familiar with Gaia's chosen. Almost nervously, he moved his gaze back to the trail ahead. She has a habit of always providing for both sides during a war. Her kind are especially good at healing others. As he talked, he started rubbing his shoulder. I got to know several of them quite well. Severin caught himself rubbing his shoulder and deliberately took a hold of the horse's reins. He paused for a minute, seemingly lost in memories. He cleared his throat and continued. Anyway, since I spent so much time with them, I was able to pick up a bit more about how their powers worked than any other type of chosen I met. I can probably help you far more than I'll be able to help Roland. He stopped the group and turned his horse so he was facing everyone. Roland's eyes widened. Then how will I learn? Severin raised an eyebrow. I didn't say I couldn't teach you, just that I'll be far more used to Sarah. Severin paused and considered his options for a moment. He straightened his shoulders and started speaking again, having come to a decision. Sarah, Roland, for now all I want you to do is focus on feeling the power within you. Every day while we ride, if I am not deliberately showing you something about the trail we are taking, you are to focus on familiarizing yourself with the feel of this power. It'll feel different for both of you. Talk about it if you like, but you won't really be able to help each other. Sarah and Roland exchanged glances, both looking hopeful. Severin paused and turned to Sarah. Sarah, your powers come from the earth. Calming your spirit and watching the wilderness around us may help you search for yours. Roland, Severin turned. Yours are a bit more tumultuous. From what I've been told, Felvar's strength lies in passions. Indecision, hesitation, these traits will separate you from the gifts he has given you. You have to not only become familiar with your powers, but learn how to live with resolve and drive. Roland took all this in and realized he already had some evidence of what Severin had said was true. As he had gotten lost in his worries, he had noticed it felt like that new well of energy inside of him had slipped further and further away. But now, after Severin had started distracting them from their worries, he could feel it building up again, deep inside. Severin turned his horse and started moving the group along again. We will travel every day as long as we physically can. We will stop 1 hour before sundown. During that time, I will teach Roland the sword and Cyrus the staff. Sarah? He glanced over his shoulder at Sarah and smiled. You really don't need any further training with the bow. Instead, you'll practice shooting for 10 minutes every evening, then join in learning whichever weapon you would like. Sarah beamed with pride. Severin had rarely given compliments, and as far as she was concerned, he had just given her the best compliment he possibly could. I wouldn't mind learning a bit more about sword fighting, she said, pride in her voice. Cyrus's mouth hung open. He seemed shocked. Finally he burst out, The staff? I just used a staff last night because it was the first thing I came across. I want to learn to fight with a sword. There's nothing wrong with fighting with a staff, Severin said calmly. It is equally useful for both defense and offense. Seeing as how you lack any sort of powers, you'll need to practice both. Severin quieted for a moment. An idea seemed to come to him, and he smiled as if he had just found a gold piece lying on the ground. You know what? Change of plans. We'll need someone to set up camp and prepare our meal for the evening when we stop. Sarah, Roland, you will each train only every other day. You'll take turns setting up camp and cooking dinner. Sarah groaned. You are seriously going to make us eat food Roland makes? Absolutely. If you think he is such a bad cook, then teach him how to be better. After practice, of course. He looked back at Cyrus, the wicked grin returning. As for you, not only will you train the first hour we stop every day, but you and I are going to have private sparring sessions every evening for the second hour after we stop, as well as any other free time we might have. You'll need the extra help. Fear and sadness washed across Cyrus's face. Roland couldn't help but smile. Cyrus had always hated hard work more than any other boy in the village. Being the blacksmith's son, even small household chores had been difficult work. So, Cyrus had grown incredibly averse to anything he saw as extra work. This was probably, to Cyrus, the worst thing that could have happened to him on this trip. Roland, on the other hand, felt a bit better about the trip. He could handle doing chores every other day. If he knew Severin nearly as well as he thought he did, chores would be a welcome break from training. Before you two get too excited by the prospect of training on alternating days, Severin said, as if he were reading Roland's mind, know that while you are doing your chores, you'll be focusing on feeling your powers. When not training your body, you'll at least train your mind. Sarah smiled wryly at Roland. They both burst out laughing. Cyrus was still incredulous. Twice as much training, he shouted, causing Sarah and Roland to laugh that much harder. That is so unfair. And all they must do is set up camp every other day and think extra hard? I find myself wishing more and more I'd been given some sort of power. Trust me, before this is over, you'll understand why you are better off without our shackles, Severin muttered to himself. Chapter 9. Elutia, the neutral meeting grounds of the gods, was divine even in its simplicity. Being an ethereal location, with no corresponding terrestrial location, it was small. Gentle light seemed to filter in from above, no sun producing it, and illuminated a stone dais on which sat a golden bowl. The floor was a simple cobble like a city street, but each stone shone faintly with energy and had a small ruin carved at the center. There were no walls, instead a billowing mist marked the edge of the room. Access to the realm was provided by Cronus, though he didn't create it. It existed in the instant where the future becomes the present. Gaia walked into Elutia with her usual grace, stepping through the portal as if she were the focal point of everyone in the room. To suit her frustration, she was draped in autumnal red robes and simple slippers. No jewelry today. She wanted to focus on the matters at hand, not impress. She marched to her position on the east side of the dais, directly opposite Felvar. To her right stood Maitreya, god of peace. To her left stood Cronus, god of time, neither of which she was very friendly with. She locked eyes with Felvar and sent him what she hoped was her most scathing look. In her opinion, he was the most responsible for their current predicament. Lear, god of water, at the southern point of the dais, cleared his throat. Now that Gaia has made her typical dramatic entrance, shall we begin? He asked. Lear had the look of an upper-class gentleman. He was dressed in a clean-pressed white shirt and crisp, creased pants. His voice complimented his appearance and title, smooth and fluid. He kept his medium-length black hair slicked back and was always meticulously shaved. Our little wooden soldier is free, and presumably he's about to start wreaking havoc. Our colleagues Tweedledee and Tweedledum, he gestured to Guy and Felvar respectively, assured us he was well within his cage, never to bother us again. Apparently, they weren't tending to their duties quite properly. Now, how shall we deal with this lack of attention to detail? He smiled as if he hadn't the slightest idea he had just insulted the two gods. I built the cage, Gaia snarled. I built the grove to keep his powers from strengthening. I sacrificed a great portion of my strength to keep him locked up. Her voice started to rise, all pretense at composure dropping. Her eyes locked with Lear's. I did the slaves' portion of the labor. Felvar was supposed to keep watch over the village and make sure no one violated the rules of the sacrifice. The shadow of his damn mountain practically falls on the cursed place. She took a few deep breaths, crossed her arms, and straightened herself. I did my part. Well, dear, the warm voice of Cronus came from beside her. That is not entirely true. You did your part in the deal between Felvar and yourself, but as a team you failed. He is free. Cronus, as usual, was simply dressed in brown robes. Cronus looked like a man of 50, completely bald but with a magnificent pepper-gray beard. Despite the appearance of age, he was also solid with broad shoulders and an air of wisdom. Time for you to stop acting like a spoiled child and acknowledge your part in events for once. You don't hear Felvar spouting nonsense about how this isn't his fault, do you? He nodded towards Felvar. Felvar, for once earnest and serious, responded in his most solemn tone. There's nothing to protest. This release is ultimately my fault. And while I don't appreciate Guy's attempts to foist the blame, she is ultimately right. The lion's share of the blame is on me. It was wrong to trap him to begin with, Ogun, god of justice, boomed beside Felvar. Ogun was the only god present dressed for war, with a red enameled breastplate and sword strapped to both hips. He wore light tan leather armor that contrasted with his dark complexion. Everything about his presence suggested seriousness, even the way he breathed. He should have been given at least a chance, as we gave Orcus before him. Locking him away immediately after his creation was unjust. My dear fiery prince, Gaia purred at him. Have you forgotten that a war with Orcus is what led to Dis's creation? Or that Orcus was trying to kill us all? Why even risk it again? She waved her hand in the air, as if dissipating a bad smell. Besides, we've already went over this. Let's focus on the here and now. I agree, said Lear. And the here and now is how we are to handle this mess that the two of you have left us. He raised his hand to stop Gaia as she started to protest again. My apologies. We can debate guilt and innocence later. If we work together, there is no reason why we can't quickly recapture him. After all, he's hardly any more experienced now than he was when you first locked him away. I'm not so sure that's true, Felvar chimed in. While I had the upper hand in our little battle, he honestly didn't seem to be trying, and when Gaia tried to snare him, he simply killed off her plants. He paused, concern moving across his face. He may not have been able to do anything for the past millennia, but I believe he has at least had enough time to think over how his powers work. He was clever. He would have found a way to make at least some of his time useful. Imprisoning him was hardly a just the first time, Ogun repeated. While he is a creature of chaos, even he deserves the justice of a true fight. We should face him in battle. Once we win, then we could imprison him. At the least, giving him a chance to win. And I suppose, mocked Lear, you would want us to face him in a series of one-on-one fights, for justice and all. Of course, responded Ogun, confusion wrinkling his brow. How else would the fight be fair if there were to be duels? He leaned forward on the dais, a small smile curling up at the corner of his mouth. But I'm not that foolish. Fighting chance doesn't mean he has to be taken down in a duel, Lear. Though I'd be happy to see if your skills have gotten rusty after the meeting, if you would like. Violence should be completely avoided, Maitreya's quiet voice offered. Of all the gods, he was the only one with a simple presence. His clothes were that of a peasant, and his overall demeanor was that of a monk. Why we continue to let this mockery of a god attend our meetings escapes me, Ogun said with a sneer. He turned vengeful eyes at Maitreya. He would have us cower and simply beg Dis to be nice. He lacks the pride needed to act. Maitreya smiled at Ogun. That is a marvelous idea. I don't believe any of us ever tried simply talking to Orcus. Maybe his heir will be more apt to listen to reason. He deserves a fight, Ogun snarled at Maitreya. His kind violates the rules of justice at every turn. However, he was never given the chance at justice himself. Despite his current existence as the embodiment of unjust and unlawful intent, he still deserves fair treatment. He is owed fair treatment. And I'm sure he sees his actions as just, Maitreya shrugged. After all, justice is relative. As Ogun started to take a step towards Maitreya, the large hand of Felvar fell onto his shoulder. Old brother, he said soothingly, we have these councils to exchange opinions. We must stay calm, or there is no reason for us to ever meet if we have to always be worried about offending one another. Ogun took a breath and nodded to Felvar. Lear chuckled. Besides, it's not like any of us could do anything to the little monk anyway. Of course, a Shadow Walker would have the opinion of a coward. Ogun turned his glare to Lear. I prefer to fight my battles in the open. Cronus sighed. Children, if we are done fighting impotently amongst ourselves, could we please go back to the matter at hand? Ogun moved back to his place at the dais, a slight streak of embarrassment crossing his face. Go on. My apologies for letting my temper get the better of me. Cronus nodded to him, then spoke. I understand your passion, Ogun. However, I believe we are looking at this the wrong way. We have no real idea what Dis will do. He has only been free for a few days at this point. Of course we know what he will do, Gaia shouted. He'll pick right back up where Orcus left off and start working to take power for himself. My dear, Cronus smiled at her. We, in fact, know nothing of the sort. I say we let him wander for a few days, see exactly what he decides to do. His actions will reveal his location and his intentions. We should act now, together, before Felvar spoke. I want to see him captured, but we should do as my brother suggests and wait, Lear interrupted. We don't even know where he is. We can't do anything right now that would matter. He smiled and with a cocky tone continued. Who knows? He might even decide to offer some sort of truce. His grin turned wicked as he continued. Or simply demand the heads of Felvar and Gaia. I'm sure even Maitreya would agree that is a small price to pay to avoid war. Both Felvar and Gaia looked outraged, but before either could speak, Maitreya spoke up for himself. I disagree. I don't believe violence is the solution. Are we done then? Ogun asked, turning to go. I'm going to start preparing my Justicars for the inevitable. He walked into the mists and vanished. Felvar, we should speak about our plan B. Gaia walked around the dais and took Felvar by the arm and started to lead him away. All the while he protested he wasn't finished speaking to the others until they vanished into the mists. Maitreya, as usual, simply vanished. It amazes me still that you can always predict how these things will turn out, brother, Lear said to Cronus as he placed an arm around his shoulder. They're as predictable as always. Everything is moving as it should. Cronus faced his brother. Just remember our plan, and don't back out on me. Never, Lear replied, every ounce of solemnity he could manage in his voice. You are my brother in both blood and spirit. If we can't depend on one another, who can we depend upon? Just remember, Cronus said, moving away. Stay the course. No matter what happens, you must have faith in me. I don't know that I can do what needs to be done otherwise. Chapter 10. The first day of traveling through the forest, Dis quite casually suggested to Lyra that she needed to be strong enough to defend herself. Of course, this had offended her. I have always managed on my own. What more do I need to learn? Well, I seem to remember my first moment of freedom being saving you from a quite nasty rat of a boy, Dis said, giving her a look with raised eyebrows that asked her to rebuke him. As well as you may have done in that little backwoods of a town, we'll be going to places that are quite a bit more complex. His body moved with his words, adding flourishes of motion to each point, making each word seem like that was what moved him and not his muscles. No, my dear, the world you are entering now, he swooped ahead of her to look her in the eye, is dangerous in ways you have never had reason to contemplate before. He placed a hand on her shoulder and leaned forward. Thieves, murderers, rapists, all constantly hidden and knowing full well how to hide. Just as quickly as he'd become serious, he bounded off again, back to the light-hearted jaunt he had turned from. But your father, being the Lord of Darkness, and a not half-bad swordsman, can help you a little. He smiled at Lyra and gave her a wink. She thought he was being a bit dramatic. I doubt it is as dangerous as you say, and even if it is, she caught his eye. As you so eloquently pointed out, I am traveling with a god. Ah, yes, he smiled, but I cannot watch you all the time. Omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence are all good selling points for worshippers, but none of us really have any of them. And do you really want me to be your primary means of self-defense anyway? He raised an eyebrow at her again. No. She didn't need to explain further. She'd always been alone. She didn't feel she should need someone else, even now. Then we shall have to train you, at least a little. His smile became mischievous. I think we shall start with the art of running. He stopped and turned to face her. Lyra looked quizzically at Dis. Running? She was incredulous. Running? What were you saying about learning to defend myself? She blew out a breath, and with it one last running. Running builds endurance, and the most important part of battle is being able to outlast your opponent. His voice took on the tone of a teacher, serious, straightforward, almost monotonous. You shall start by learning to run, and keep running. Not every battle is worth fighting, and those that are may require you to run to change your position. A slow rhythm started to build in his voice, entrancing Lyra. Running to higher ground, running to obtain a new weapon, running to get the help of an ally, running to help an ally. All of these are situations that a good warrior will encounter, and you shall be prepared for them. His expression flattened, darkness seemed to float through his eyes. And now you will start running. I believe you need a little motivation. Dis whistled. Lyra heard a rustle coming from a nearby bush. Wondering what Dis had called, she started to walk towards it. Once she was within a few feet of the bush, a wolf as big as her leapt out onto the path. The wolf was mangy, its fur had fallen out in several places, and its mouth frothed as if rabid. Lyra started to back away, but for each step she took backwards, the wolf took 2 forwards. Please, help, she whispered, fear gripping her heart. Don't worry, came Dis's flattened voice. He won't hurt you more than a scratch or dragging you to the ground. He knows better than to do any more than inconvenience you. Dis stepped between Lyra and the wolf, leaning over, locking his gaze with his red, cracked eyes. Don't you? The wolf seemed to go down into a bow. Now, my dear, Dis turned toward Lyra, a tilted smile on his face. You should start running. The better you do, the further behind this pathetic excuse of an animal will be, and the less likely you will be to get to meet his teeth. And thus, Lyra ran.